It's so good to finally see you. We're in a slight role reversal, so I get to ask you some questions, which is normally the reverse. So tell me, give me a little intro. Like, who is Nikola Danaylov?
Well, Nikola Danaylov is basically a seeker, a curious person, a low-level philosopher interested in the simplest of all philosophies, not the Kantian deontological, kind of philosophy, but rather the simple, practical philosophy that you can use every day in your life that originates in ancient Greece and Rome, and how that can make not only our life better, but how can it make us better people, and how can it make other people's lives better?
So is this a particular philosophy, or is this you grasping from various sources?
Well, yes and no. So it is a particular philosophy to the degree that I love Stoic philosophy, but also there's a lot of mixture of some Platonism, some Epicureanism. I loved Epicurus and Lucretius, especially the Rerum Natura. I love even the Cyrenaic school with Aristippus. Plato, of course, I mentioned the Socratic method of investigation, which is the so-called the dialectical method of investigation. I'm trying to model most of my interviews on that model, and to the degree that I've succeeded or failed, it is sort of like the ideal and idealized model that I kind of would like to aspire to. I think I'm very far from it, but on a good day, maybe I get a little closer than on a bad day. So yeah, it's that kind of mixture, because I find that the ancients, they lived a very pure and simple life, in the sense that philosophy for them was not some kind of academic pursuit. It was a daily vocation. It was something that you take as a tool, as I said, to make yourself better, to make your life better, to make your friends and your family better off, and to make the world a better place. So that was the original, love of wisdom. Wisdom that you can apply today and right now in your daily troubles, in your daily dilemma, in your very human life, not in some kind of a theoretical, divorced fashion that has nothing to do with your life.
It's sort of the opposite of academia, or at least, well, it's not supposed to be the opposite of academia, but you speak to a lot of academics and intellectuals. So we've interviewed a lot of people, but you've spoken to a lot of these people in the, I don't even know what to call it, transhuman, progressive people. And so I would say you're an expert in a lot of these things, future and transhuman.
I don't like to say that I'm an expert. I'm just someone who had the pleasure of meeting and talking and having good conversations, and occasionally bad conversations, with some of those people that you mentioned that are at the cutting edge of not only transhumanism, but artificial intelligence, genetics, robotics, nanotech, synthetic biology, 3D printing, cryptocurrencies, any kind of sort of exponential or disruptive technology that would have radical, revolutionary, fundamental global implications with respect to our whole and entire civilization. And so I don't like to say that I'm an expert, because it's been at least 15 years, and if one thing that I've learned is that after 250 interviews on the record, and maybe at least double or triple that off the record, I've learned that I know that I don't know, and that and I'm not saying that because I'm a Socratic fan, I'm saying it because it truly is the case, that the more I've learned here, the more I've learned that, the amount of my ignorance will always dwarf my knowledge, and that gap, even though I've basically decided to devote my life to this, will never be closed. And I'm always, surprised by stuff that I should know, but I don't know. And that's very basic stuff for other people, whether in other fields or even in this field. And for example, FM 2030 is one of those examples where I have quite frankly, very little knowledge about FM 2030, and it's definitely one of my, probably the biggest gaps I have in sort of my transhumanist genealogy, if you will. At least I am aware of that, because another thing that I've learned is that some of those super smartest people around the world don't realize that.
So you were saying, in terms of like some of these people who are, you know, intellectually,
this presumption that when they're experts or recognized experts in a particular field, then they're entitled to make pronouncements which they hardly believe to be flawed in any way possible in any other field. And that's, by the way, particularly true, I find, about scientists, and especially about physicists. Imagine, like, the prototypical example is, I think, Lawrence Krauss. You know, it seems to me that genius and stupidity are roommates under the same roof quite often. And you know, in one case, your sort of particular neurological, intellectual wiring can be pure genius as applied to a particular field or occasion or context. And in another case, that same neurological wiring can make you literally autistic or idiotic to handle basic common sense situations, you know, not only safely, but with like the least amount of like humility and grace, if you will. So we are these kinds of funny creatures which exhibit both utmost stupidity and unbelievable genius.
it's like money and intelligence doesn't necessarily equate to roundedness or grace, as you put it, or dignity. I mean, yeah, I mean, we are complicated creatures. So, well, the first question is, like, what were your initial reactions to our strange film?
Well, that's a brave question you ask, because you already know what I'm going to answer, and you kind of sort of implied a little bit there, based on my initial sort of back and forth with your assistant, or your friend Emily, anyway. So I thought that the movie was, first of all, from a technical point of view, very well produced. I think it was a job well done, clearly by professionals. I thought that the editing, the cutting in, the cutting out, the camera work were fantastic. I thought that there were a few very sort of cinematic moments in the movie, which were excellent. I thought the soundtrack was very appropriate and very well done too. I love that too. So from a technical point of view, I thought, I don't think how you can really improve that movie. As I said, work of professionals, professionally done. Now, I do think, though, that one of two things happened. Either I totally didn't get the movie myself, or the movie was very confused and confusing at the same time. And maybe it's kind of a little bit of both, because it's kind of like straddling the line between a documentary, a mockumentary, a science fiction, a comedy, a POV reality show. Like, it's so many things at the same time. So I think it's like jack of all trades, master of none in the end, you know. And again, that's my sort of simplistic, highly skewed and personally subjective sort of interpretation of the film. It's not the truth, it's just a point of view.
There is no truth. There is only points of view. I mean, that's not true exactly, but in terms of subjective, when one is viewing, you know, creative works, I mean, there's obviously one aspires to put something together that's going to appeal to the most people, or at least try to appeal to a swath of people. And, you know, some people will get it and be entertained.
At some moments I was entertained, but it just, if you cut it into a number of smaller pieces, maybe each piece makes sense on its own. But how it came together and to what it amounted to and it came together. Now, is it a documentary? Is it a tribute film? Is it a science fiction? Which part of it was true? Which part of it was false? Which part of it was science? Which part of it was science exaggeration or science fiction? Which one was like archival footage and which one was like reenacting? And you can make, you know, sort of some guesses, educated guesses about each of those things, but they were like so mixed up in the end that for me it was like, okay, tell me, you as a filmmaker, what was the main thing that you were going for to accomplish with this movie? What was like...
But we had three intents, and the first intent was to get people to think about some of the things that FM had been talking about. So not just around extended longevity or immortality, but to sort of think about this world that he posited, which is a wonderful world in many ways, and think about, you know, where are we? And then I felt that there were a lot of questions that society hasn't asked. You know, if these things are truly happening or going to happen, you know, there are a lot of things that are beyond the philosophical, the practicalities. It's like you said initially, like, you know, a philosophy that is going to guide your life, that has practice. And so I felt like there were conversations out there that we weren't having as a society. So I think first and foremost, it was probably that was an intent, or maybe the intent. And then the second was, you know, this was somebody that was very important to me. And I felt that, I don't like to use the word biopic, but essentially to create some sort of record of this person's life. And then thirdly, and this is the trickiest part, and it's probably a part that throws some people, was to get people that didn't know anything about any of this subject and to get them thinking about the themes that you and I, to some degree, are concerned with, in a way that wasn't science fiction, was a way that was palpable. And what was clear as we had screenings and so on was that, you know, people took that hook, line, and sinker. You know, they really believed, you know, the world that we created was a believable one, and they were asking the questions that we wanted them to ask, people that didn't have. What was surprising to me was how fearful some people were of this future that we were positing and FM posited. So I think these were the three intents. Now, how we did it was different. I mean, different, hard, challenging.
I may not be your audience in the sense that I already come with a bag, like a truckload of presumptions. And so when you put someone from a place so-called like Clio, was it Clio Cryonics, like a place that doesn't exist, and a bunch of, quote, experts that don't exist, because I should kind of have heard them, and then you start sneaking around the lab with like technology that doesn't exist, and you mix that with the real stuff that does exist.
Yeah, I was most worried about, I'll put you in the category of people that I quote unquote respected, and people that I knew, like some people that were in the film, and what they would feel we had done. Was it manipulative? Was it, you know, going for some sort of cheap, I don't say laughs, but cheap drama? And so I was worried about that. And so, you know, luckily, I mean, surprisingly, in some ways, you know, particularly with Aubrey, loved it, you know, and that to me, like, was, oh, maybe everybody else will love it. That's not been the case. I don't know what everybody else has
What
has
about
thought.
the sort of the average Joe? That because Aubrey and me, we're kind of tainted.
Right?
Yeah.
But I was more worried in a way. I was more worried about you guys. In a way, I was more worried because I knew you. I you know, some of those people, I took their time, their work, and so on. So I was worried. The average Joe, it's been strange. I mean, either they hate it because it's either boring, or they have some sort of expectation, or they love it, but they're not, I wanted people to be excited. I didn't want to make I wanted to make a film about the future that posited certain things that wasn't dystopian. That was an intent as well. We had all these things that we wanted to achieve, and some of them we did, and some of them, perhaps we didn't, and some of them...
I found it interesting at some points. I find it entertaining at other points. I find it, irritating at some points, and I find it informative at other points about the life of FM 2030, right? But that's just me. Who cares about one person, so-called expert? It takes guts and it takes courage to have a vision and to go through with that vision. So good for you for that, no matter the naysayers. And as the old saying goes, the dogs will bark and the caravan would still go on. So you gotta do what you gotta do, and you have to go where you have to go, and good for you, and let the dogs be barking.
No, I really do appreciate that. So, I mean, you've known about FM as you've sort of got into all of these areas. Tell me, when you first came across him, what spoke to you about what he was saying?
Yeah, I came across him like in the early, maybe mid-2000s, like at the very beginning when I was sort of starting to hear about the ideas of transhumanism. So for me, what happened was I first read I can't remember if I first read Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, and then I read Charlie Strauss's Accelerando, which is the same thing, only the science fiction version of it. Or if I read first Accelerando and then read Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near. But these two books that I somehow happened to read one right after the other totally blew out my mind at that time. And that's the first time when I sort of like got exposed to the ideas of the technological singularity and transhumanism. Then I kind of discovered the work of Max More and his writings in the 90s, maybe even in the late 80s, the Extropians and so on. Then I discovered Natasha. Then I discovered FM 2030. I did my master's degree thesis on related topics. I did a lot of reading at the time by Max More. I did some reading by FM 2030, but those were just like specific parts. And again, that was about 15 years ago. And then basically that led me to this conversation with you here today, because after my graduation, I think it was 2008, at the beginning of the, or at the peak of the recession, I had like a bunch of scholarships, awards, intellectual, academic accomplishments, and other nonsense that nobody cared about in a context where people were cutting jobs, not hiring people. So I stopped counting after I sent out maybe 300 resumes out. And in the end, one of my applications was for a staff writer for the Singularity Hub, which at the time was the first blog on topics related to AI, the singularity, and transhumanism. And I thought, I did my master's degree on this topic. People say I'm a decent writer. I already have 3 or 4 years of intellectual labor in this field and investment. I'm perfect for these guys. And then it took a week or two to realize they're not calling me either. So they didn't call me, and then it took another week or two for me to come up somehow with a very strange idea that maybe I don't need them. Maybe I can start this whole thing on my own. And first I started the blog, then I started the podcast, and here we are today. So, and I even remember interviewing Max More, because he was obviously one of the very first people I interviewed, maybe around 2010, 2009, when I started the podcast, and asking him about FM 2030 and things like that. So that's the time and how I got introduced to both transhumanism and FM 2030.
Yeah, I mean, transhumanism has taken on many different sort of iterations. I mean, there are some aspects that I think are across the board. But how does your brand of transhumanism, or the one that you most click with, how does that differ, or how is it similar to perhaps FM 2030's sort of brand of transhumanism?
So my journey with transhumanism has been one of attraction and one of repulsion. Basically, in the beginning, when I started, I thought that transhumanism is that kind of a narrative or overarching story that has the potential to bring humanity together on a global scale. And after sort of talking to, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of transhumanists on and off the record, meeting them in person, etc., I've concluded that at least in its current form and its current version, it absolutely is not. Not only that, but I've personally have stopped using the term transhumanist as far as I'm concerned personally. Even though that has disappointed a lot of my fans, because, you know, I had a popular article that I wrote 10 years ago maybe called the Transhumanist Manifesto, and, you know, which is sort of like a very sort of declaratory, sort of like we would defeat death and all that stuff, kind of simplistic. I think I prefer to what you would call transhuman, I prefer to call human, and I think that transhumanism is basically humanism, it should be anyway, and so I don't even want to differentiate, but it comes with a certain baggage which is very dangerous, and it's not only dangerous for us, but it's dangerous for the whole world. And what I mean by that is this. So in transhumanism, we have this idea and generally that's not a necessarily, again, transhuman idea. That's idea coming from humanism and coming from the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and so on. And we can sort of trace the genealogy of that idea, and that's the primacy of man, or a primacy of humanity. So, you know, it used to be the case that historically speaking, in the hunter-gatherer society, we considered ourselves not to be different from the world around us. We considered ourselves to be a part of the world, not a part of the world. And our religion was, you know, sort of pantheistic. We had lots of gods and animalistic. So animals could have, you know, sort of anthropomorphic or human features and souls and the stones and rivers and trees and the sky and this and that. And each one of us was kind of at a sort of a democratic level, decentralized, right? But then we moved from there to the theistic and especially monotheistic step of our development, where, you know, there was a single God on the throne, and we were his creation, his children, especially men, not humanity, but men, and we were therefore better than the rest of it, and the rest of it became simply our garden. So, in other words, for us, for our taking, to do with it as we please to do. That created this kind of a hierarchy. So God at the top, we a step below God as the sort of like his greatest creation, and the rest of the world created for us, for our own convenience, for our own everything, food, you name it, shelter, water, etc. And then with the explosion of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and humanism, we simply killed God. We had a coup d'etat, and we installed ourselves on that sort of throne. And then we denigrated the animals even further by sort of perceiving them now as a mere automatons or automata, as Descartes called them at the time, that not only had no soul, but couldn't experience pain, had no consciousness, and in other words, we could kill them and do whatever we want with them as we please, because we are humans and they're not. And men, or first of all, and then eventually humanity, but at the beginning it was men, was the center of the universe, the epitome of the Enlightenment, the measure of all things, the peak of evolution from an evolutionary point of view, which is again not the real Darwin idea, but kind of a misperceived evolutionary point of view. We became to perceive ourselves as the peak of evolution. And that basically gave us a blank check to do whatever the heck we wanted to do with the rest of our planet, whether with the animals, with the plants, with the air, with the biosphere, you name it. And then, not only that, but then we went one step further to say that, as Ray Kurzweil says, there's no evidence of any other intelligent life in the universe. It's very possible that we're the only intelligence. There's this debate between Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil. Peter says that life in the universe is probably everywhere, and we're not unique in that sense. Intelligent life we're talking about. And Ray Kurzweil thinks that we're probably very likely the only intelligent life. And therefore, we are not only the center of this pyramid on our planet, but in the whole of the universe. Humanity is this most special, most amazing epitome of anything that's ever existed. And that's kind of a very teleological, very religious kind of understanding. You simply take one God, call him, Yahweh, call him Christ, call him Muhammad, call him Buddha, call him whoever you want him, and then you replace him with man or humanity. And of course, you have immortality, which is what transhumanism promises. And you have this kind of a teleological narrative. And Ray Kurzweil is a perfect example of that with his 6 epochs of the singularity, starting with information being processed at the level originally at chemistry and physics, then going to biology, then going to brains, humanity's brains, the neocortex, then going to technology. That's the 4th stage of the singularity. Then the 5th stage is the merger of machines and humanity, transhumanity. And then the final stage is when the universe wakes up and we have giant computroniums, endless matryoshka brains, and smart dust everywhere. And that's a very nice, tight, perfect narrative, but it's not necessarily true. It's just convenient. And the universe is not here for us to have a convenient narrative, especially if you're cherry picking your data points, like Ray is doing. But it has enormous appeal, just as much, especially when you're promising people immortality and omnipotence, ever-presence, all the amazing things that the other religions are promising. And so I thought that originally this kind of transhuman narrative will be a good narrative for us to unite around. And then I discovered a number of problems and issues, in my view, with this kind of narrative. And first I started sort of divorcing myself step by step from it slowly. And secondly, I've gotten to the conclusion that first, I don't think it's likely to unite humanity. And second, even if it does, it may come at a very high price, in the sense that it's a very useful tool to justify anything that we want to do. And give us a blank check to exterminate any other living organism, not only on our planet, but across the universe. And I see that often in transhumanists. So, for example, I meet people who, when we start talking about the environment and this species just got extinct and that species just got extinct, one of the most annoying answers that I get is, oh, don't worry about it, we'll just bring them back. It's okay, we'll just bring them back as the way we're going to bring the woolly mammoth. There's two problems with that. First, it betrays profound ignorance about what a woolly mammoth is, or any other species, because it's not just a biological construct. Just like we humans are not just a biological construct. Yes, we are biological, but that's not all we are. And the same way, a woolly mammoth is not just the DNA of the woolly mammoth. It's a whole social structure. And we know the elephants have a very complicated, socially stratified societies, with a matriarch, with memories. They mourn their dead. And there's certain kinds of rituals and certain kinds of learnings and teachings. And once you kill all the woolly mammoths, even if you clone a brand new woolly mammoth, they would never actually be a woolly mammoth. They'll be just a new clone which has the same biology, but it never had the same training, the same environment, the same mental or social capacities or experiences or abilities. Just like, you know, those orangutans that they have in captivity now in Indonesia, and there's people trying to teach them to go climb on trees because they were orphaned orangutans that had to be adopted to survive. They were fed by humans. They never learned to fend for their own. And that happens with many other species that are very smart, like dolphins, orca whales, you name it. And they don't even know how to climb the trees. So yeah, you can save them biologically, and that's good. It's better than killing them, obviously. But they're never going to be the orangutan that you know to be an orangutan in a forest, jumping from a tree and being free and doing what orangutans do. Because if an orangutan can't even climb a tree, what kind of orangutan are we talking about here, right? And so that's first part of the ignorance. But second part is like, even if we can bring them back, it's like still that kind of hubris, that kind of arrogance is like, it is up to us to decide who lives and who dies at the species level. We're not talking about, I'm going to kill you to eat today. We're talking about, we're going to kill you all and we feel okay because we can bring you back.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you. I mean, I think, but these divergences, I mean, I think what you're saying, and again, is that the main flaw for your transhumanism is as we've gotten to this place, it has at its tip the supremacy of man, and not just the supremacy of man, but it's almost given agency to that supremacy. I mean, I think that's what you're saying. It's not just that we put ourselves at the top of the pyramid. We're saying we now have to utilize all the powers in terms of being at the top. And that to you feels, doesn't fulfill the promises. So I guess the question for you is, what would have been, or in terms of your whatever you've replaced this with, what are the promises of whatever the philosophy is that's going to create a fairer, more holistic world? And when I say world, I don't just mean on this planet specifically.
So that's another thing with transhumanism. It is hard for transhumanism, the idea, however you comprehend or understand that, and there's a big divergence of that sort of term. But it's hard for it to inform and guide you in your daily life, isn't it?
Look, it depends how rigorous the philosophy is and how nuanced it is. I mean, if the basic philosophy is, you know, tools are going to solve everything, technology and science is going to solve everything, I think in a way it's very limiting, because you're just like, I'm going to go to sleep. I'm actually going to go into cryogenics for the next 50 years and wait for everything to figure itself out. If it is as simplistic as that, that doesn't seem like a way to do anything. But I think there are nuances, you know, whether you ascribe to those more nuanced approach, whether it's Zoltan and sort of a very almost 20th century sort of political movement couched in all of this other stuff, or people on sort of further ends of the more, I don't want to say progressive spectrum, but less libertarian, more...
Yeah, Zoltan doesn't have a single original idea that I've ever heard from him. Most of his, if not all of his ideas, are simply intended to grab media attention. And he's either rehashing ideas from Ayn Rand or from the old extropian circles. There's not a single idea that's come from Zoltan that's original. And many of them have been either dangerous or unethical. So, for example, his thing about refugees, illegal immigrants, and others in the United States. In that debate, he was like, yeah, I feel very I sympathize with them. I feel bad for them. How about we inject them all with like microchips and follow them 24/7 and see who became the criminals and who don't, and whether they're criminals or not. Like, so You're saying on the one hand, like, oh, I sympathize at the human level with these people and their plight, and on the other hand, your proposed solution is not designed to solve anything, but if anything is going to make their lives more miserable and dangerous, but is designed to first and foremost garner as much media attention to you as possible. And the other thing is like, oh, let's sell all the public lands in the United States of America, which are, by the way, an endangered species. National parks and things like that are diminishing and threatened all the time, whether for oil or what have you, ranching, you name it. And now his proposed solution is like, oh, let's just get away with it. And by the way, that's a one-time shot, and once it's gone forever. And that's his solution for the perpetual problem. Like, it's utterly ridiculous. We need a process that resolves the problems. We don't need a one-time shot, which absolutely would not resolve anything, but will actually entrench the current sort of humongous polarization of America even more, because there would not be public parks and public lands that poor people can go camp at any point later on if that happens. There will not be. Right, and not to mention the fact that his idea, oh, let's do, you know, that's going to be $500,000, and you know, people would be able to pay for their medical bills. That's insanely ridiculous and factually false at the most crude level. I mean, a person who gets a heart attack can easily owe $700,000-800,000. My neighbor goes to Florida all the time. Her father had a heart attack in Florida. The bill was $960,000. He was in the hospital for maybe something like 2 weeks. 900 and something, almost $1 million. In the end, the insurance company put him on an air ambulance just so that they can get rid of him from the United States and bring him to Canada at any cost, just so they stop paying bills there.
Yeah, no.
Right? So what's $500,000? It's nothing. So, but this is not a conversation of Zoltan, but I'm just saying, like, those are the most popular people. In transhumanism, you have two people. Zoltan, who is the prototypical transhumanist and has been garnering 90% of the attention, and Ray Kurzweil, who is more of a singularitarian rather than transhumanist, but okay, he's also a transhumanist. He's probably the other best well-known person. And then you have Max Moore and Natasha Vitomour, like, way behind in terms of media coverage.
Yeah, I keep thinking about FM. I mean, FM early on, and I again wasn't thinking. I mean, he did have some of the same probably responses that some of these people have today in terms of some of the damage that we've done. For sure, I don't want to let him off the hook entirely, but he did see that the planet was ours and animals specifically. I mean, he was a vegan, and he really believed. He was.
And I love him for that. He was, in many ways, let me give him some credit where credit is due. He was, and that actually came up in my conversation with Max Moore, if I remember, the first one that I had like over 10 years ago, where he said something to the degree that FM 2030 was a great visionary, but not so strong on the scientific point of end of things. And that's fine. That's a fair criticism, probably. But the visionary to me is more important. And he was way, way ahead of his time, because we're talking here 60s and 70s, right? When he was able to project 60 or 70 years forwards and to be, you know, vegan after they killed his favorite lamb on this festival, right? That was a great part of the movie, by the way. And to take that position in his society as an Iranian, as a Persian, you know, that long ago, well, good for him. So he had the courage and the belief and the audacity to follow by his beliefs and to also look forward. Of course, he also had his flaws, like all of us. So, for example, his ideas about sort of direct democracy, right? Those are we know that doesn't work. And that's why we have representative democracy, and you can see that, not that representative democracy doesn't have its faults and flaws, but if you look at countries like in the Middle East, recent newer democracies, and some of the shocking laws that they have enacted, even take the example of places such as India, direct, especially instantaneous democracy, where you have constant referendums or take constant polls that guide everyone's decision, is no guarantee, no panacea at all. Yes, technology can allow us to do that, but it's not going to solve our problems. It's actually going to make them worse in many cases, because you need time to reflect. Sometimes when you get an email, it's not the best idea to immediately send an email back. Sometimes it's best to say, okay, I know how this is going to come out right now, so I'm just going to sit on it. Tomorrow, when I have digested it and when I'm not so emotionally engaged in this, I'm going to write a better email. And that's sometimes slowness is a benefit. And also, direct democracy can only work in a context where you have a very, very educated populace, one that is up to date to what the issues are, up to date to what the alternatives are, and up to date to the pros and cons of all those alternatives. And also it has to be scientifically literate and all of those things, which the American public is not. I'm sorry to say this, but it is not.
I think he felt that these systems were broken and corrupt, and I think across the board, they are. Now, what will replace them? I don't know.
They are, but here's the problem also. You can say they're broken and they're corrupt, but is it the system or is it the context? Because you have the same systems working to a different degree, either a little bit better, like in Canada compared to the US, or a lot better compared to both Canada and the US in places such as Scandinavia, for example. Right? It's the same systems more or less, but they work better because the context is different, because the population is different, because the level of education is different. The sort of the ideological milieu of their culture and the ability of each member of that society to assess and evaluate each of those ideas is at a whole other level of sophistication. And I believe that makes a big difference. So you can say, well, the system is broken, therefore let's scrap that system called democracy. Or you can say, well, why is it that the American democracy is failing so much? The Canadian one is failing less. And the Scandinavian is failing even less so. Right? And look at what we can steal from each to make it all better.
All of these things need guidelines and they need conversation. I mean, because again, we have the ability to do lots of things. I mean, this was a central plot in the film. Like, we have the ability technologically, scientifically, to do all sorts of things. That doesn't necessarily mean we should do all of those things. Because if there's anything...
Feed and clothe and shelter and provide clean water to every human being on our planet. And yet we have something like 800 million people who are starving. We have 2.5 billion people without access to clean water. And we throw here North America, and Canadians are actually worse than Americans in many ways because we consume more energy than you guys per capita.
Really?
Absolutely. We consume more energy per you because we're a richer country than you in terms of natural resources, because we have a gargantuan country and a smaller population. So per capita, we have more fresh water, more energy, and more things than the Americans do. And that's why we consume more of those. We consume more units of energy and more fresh water than Americans. So we're in that way worse than you. In terms of our impact per capita is more damaging than the average American.
It's not even so much the exploiting of the planet. I don't like the word, but it's also this, there is a selfishness or an ego that is detrimental. It allows us to still have infant mortality and various other things that we really, as you say, we should have gotten rid of. And so the question is...
That's part of our narrative, right? Because you say you don't like the word exploiting the environment. But once you have human at the center of the universe, and once you have us as the measure of everything, then it's right there in the narrative. Then, you know, nature, we stop being a part of nature, but we become a part of her, and she's feminine and we're masculine. And then we have this kind of Freudian post-Freudian Oedipus complex of conquering nature, of like subduing us, which is basically a kind of a masculine rape dream of some sort, you know, and which we are kind of doing, right? And all that stems from that narrative, which puts us way above nature, right? And separates us. And transhumanism separates us even further and makes us even more special, because we're not only going to transcend humanity, because the reason right now we're human is because we're connected to nature, but we're going to be transhuman when we transcend nature, when we transcend biology, and that's even more separating us and therefore allowing us to do even more damage to her, while not realizing that damaging her is damaging us. But it's okay, because we're transhuman.
You know, one of the most interesting people that I met, not only because he's interesting and he was intellectually really a really smart person, he was a really lovely, decent person, is Ken Hayworth. And I mean, I think he would probably describe himself as a transhumanist, but I think it's less about supremacy and more about the oneness, what it means to be a part of this thing, not just in terms of the planet, but also our fellow human beings. Now, there's something that's a little earthy crunchy about that concept, but at the same time, it dovetails into this idea that we are living on this planet. It is giving us sustenance, and we are giving it, well,
but that's anti-transhumanism right there. That, you can call that animism, you can call it Buddhism, you can call it Hinduism, you can call it Chi, whatever you want to call it. You can't call that transhumanism, because transhumanism is actually very different. And by the way, the most popular idea of transhumanism, stemming both from Zoltan and from Ray, is a very individualistic one, which we shouldn't forget, right? And with Zoltan is even more to the Ayn Randian end than Ray, because with Zoltan it's even more like, you know, we are our own people, we are islands, you know, there's no society but, you know, a bunch of individuals doing their own best interest, you know, and so if there's no society, forget about nature then. You know, if you cut out that unit completely out of everything else, then the unit either is not responsible or shouldn't care about anything else, other than its own rational self-interest, of course.
You know, it's funny because I am thinking about FM as you're talking about. You've got these two personalities, very interesting personalities, Zoltan and Ray. And here was FM talking about these idea of catalysts, and he would have included you as a catalyst, that we have to have these conversations. And whether, you know, the term doesn't quite fit, we reshape the term. I mean, look, humanity, as much as here we are conversating and exchanging ideas, and that's wonderful. There's also historically been a terrible violence attached to this. And again, if we look at certain metrics, and I'm not a metrics person, but metrics are important. We have seen some improvements. I mean, even in regards to, as we became aware of what we were doing in environmentalism, there has been a whole, you know, a growth in the environmental movement and in people being caretakers for our planet, or at least being concerned for our planet. Is it where it should be? Probably not. Well, 100% not. But I guess, you know, the idea that we are going to have a better future is one that is appealing. Does that mean a better future at the expense of...
But is that a transhumanist idea, or is that an idea related to progress? Because when Francis Bacon invented the idea of progress, right, that there was no transhumanism. You know, before Francis Bacon, there was no idea, there was no concept of progress. The idea was that the world is and will always remain to be. And children lived basically like their grandfathers used to live, usually in the same place, usually doing the same jobs and making a living in the same exact way. The idea of progress never existed. And it was Francis Bacon, for the first time in the 1500s, who came up with the idea from his Christian zeal, by the way, he invented the term progress, first of all, 150 years before the Industrial Revolution, and considered it to be the highest charity of a good Christian, because, and especially to become a good scientist, because a good scientist could impact positively the future generations, and that was the nicest thing that a good Christian could ever do, right? But that idea is not a transhuman idea.
Well, I guess what for me makes it transhuman in light of how we frame it today is that progress is measured on our efficiency and I mean, this is what people say. Again, I don't like to term myself a transhumanist. I don't like to term myself with any particular labels, except that I care about my fellow human being. I want my children's life on this planet to be as free of hardship and pain and so on. And I'd like it to be a friendlier, nicer world. That's what I'd like. And whether that's transhumanism, humanism, singularity 2.3 or 4.8, it doesn't matter to me. Some of this is semantics. Now, language is important. How we express ideas is important. So for the question, the transhumanist will say that this progress that we are making is because of science and technology. To me, the danger of that is it's not just the science and the technology. There are other aspects too. And so Francis Bacon may have created progress. We're now seeing progress as a result of some of these technological advances sort of labeled in this way, that this is going to be the savior, not of the world and everything that lives in it, but the human being. And this, I think this is a problem, as you've described it.
But here's the crux of the matter, and maybe we're coming here to the most important point, the bottom line. Let me start by saying, so transhumanists often identify science and technology with transhumanism. That's not the case. You can have, and you did have, science and transhumanism, science and technology without transhumanism. Okay, so we shouldn't conflate them. But the important stuff is this, and you kind of went for that sort of pitfall right now. You demonstrated it, that it was the science and technology who did all this progress. No, it was not the science and technology. It was us. It was humanity choosing to take one course of action in favor, one kind of outcome over another kind of outcome. And science and technology were merely the enabler or the tool, but not the agent and not the primary mover and not the cause of these things happen. Which is why, of course, today we have the science and the technology to accomplish many things, as I mentioned, shelter, food for every living, clean water for every living being on our planet, but we're not doing it, not because of lack of science and technology, but because we lack commitment and because of other reasons, non-technological and non-scientific. And that's the crux of the matter. What does transhumanism have to offer to us for our future is what I asked myself one day. And my conclusion is that Stoicism and basic ethics has a lot more to offer than transhumanism. Why? Because technology and science are merely a means to an end, a tool, a how to do things. That's what transhumanism is, because especially if it goes for the fall and identifies itself with science and transhumanism. It's merely a tool. It's how we do things. But the more important issue is why we want to do certain things and what do we want to do, how we organize our priorities. And only then do we go for the particular science and the particular technology that can build or destroy one vision over another vision. And those are choices that are ethical choices. They don't stem from science and they don't stem from technology. They stem from ethics. They stem from values. They stem from our integrity. They stem from our compassion. They stem from many other things for which transhumanism in general has had very little to say. And I have to give some credit here to FM 2030 because he's been criticized that he's been non-scientific by many of the later transhumanists, like, as I said, Max Moore and extropians and stuff like that. But as I said, for me, being visionary is more important. And I personally, though I don't know as much about him as I should, I think he was a much a man of a higher integrity than our modern transhumanists. I think he was a man of higher values, because one way you can judge a man is by their dreams and by their visions and by their aspirations, and by that measure he's way above our present well-known transhumanists, whether Zoltan, whether Max, whether Ray, whoever else. Yes, he may be less scientific than them, but he is a better visionary, with more compassion, with more humanity, with the heart of a poet, with the soul of an artist. And I value that more. And again, because those are the things that inspire the science. Those are the things that motivate us to build a dream, to make it a reality, to destroy another dream, to get up and fight against an injustice. Not the science and the technology, but those things. And so to the degree that he was unscientific and not of the ilk of our modern transhumanist, is to the degree that I really like him, and to the degree that I think he would outlast them all in that sense and in that way and in that capacity. And that's why I've personally gravitated back to maybe where his intellectual origin was. In literature, in philosophy, in ethics, in ancient Greece and Rome, to the nature, to the essence of what it means to be human, because that's the essence which is going to help us steer towards our future, one version of it or another, and which eventually will be responsible to whether we destroy ourselves or we populate the universe as Ray Kurzweil, or conquer the universe as like a hyper-masculine, you know, wet dream come true. So whether we make it or break it would not depend on the science and on the technology, but how it is applied, on our values, on our integrity, on our compassion, and about our narrative, who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going. And I personally found that transhumanism didn't give me satisfactory answers to those things.
It was such a beautiful, we should really end it there, because you gave such a beautiful rendition. The last question I have for you is really your greatest hopes and then your biggest fears, or maybe your biggest fears and greatest hopes. But before I ask you that, I mean, FM, you're right, because FM's whole ethos was the greatest advance that we can make is in our attitude and our values, what we value. I mean, that was what he felt was the biggest leap we can take. And quite frankly, in order for us to fulfill the other quote unquote promises of his vision, he felt like we needed to have a attitude facelift or a value facelift. And I think, especially given where we are right now with coronavirus, etc., I think we definitely are in need of a shift, whether that's a transhuman shift, a value shift, a human shift, I don't know. But
the biggest leap we can make right now is non-technological, it's non-scientific. And I'll give you an example, two examples, one at the level of the coronavirus you just gave me, but also at the human level. So why do I make the silly claim that the biggest leap is not scientific? Someone would say, are you crazy? We need a vaccine and everything will be solved. No, everything will be solved in Scandinavia. Everything will be solved in Canada, because everyone would get the shot for free, and there's not going to be 18 different implementations of that scientific solution. You know, if you have, even today you have the scientific solution with 52 states, with I don't know however many providers you guys have, with the fact that is it going to be free? But is it not going to be free? But who is going to pay for it? Is it the state? Is it the government? But is that socialism if the government pays for it? Oh, that's max of socialism, because, you know, I came to have lunch with Peter Voss in California, and me and my wife were sitting down in the restaurant, and his partner, the first thing that she said to us was, so how are you all feeling up there in socialist Canada? And my wife almost dropped, like, that's the first thing that she says. We've never even met her, right? And we're just sitting to have lunch with them. And my wife is like, excuse me, is this a real question? Is this a real question? And then Peter is like, but they don't see themselves as socialists. You know, they really don't, honey. And I'm like, so why are we socialists? Because we have free healthcare and we're socialists? You know, I grew up in socialism. Let me tell you, it's nothing like Canada. Absolutely nothing like Canada, right? And then we were like, so where are you from, by the way? And she's like, Texas. And we're like, okay, so I guess we're going to have a lunch of stereotypes today, right? But the point is, even if you have the scientific solution today in the United States, look at the mess that you guys are in. Do you think it's going to be implemented and be solved so easily? I don't think so, because I think the biggest shift you guys need to make, and that's true for the rest of the world, for us too, in most other senses, maybe not in this particular example, but the biggest shift with respect to our future globally is not a technological and it's not a scientific shift, because we already live in the context where our technological and scientific prowess is growing exponentially. But our intellectual, emotional, wisdom growth is lagging, not only because it's moving linearly, but it's maybe not moving at all or very slowly. So when you have an exponential technological and scientific growth and a sort of an ethical, moral, compassionate wisdom growth index very slowly keeping up, then you have the gap growing and growing and growing and growing. And so all the problems that we face today, the humanity is facing today, whether global warming, whether pandemics, whether soil erosion, whether ocean acidification, whether species extinction, are the same thing over and over again, playing itself in a different realm. And that's our technological and scientific capacity way outpacing our intellectual and moral ability to control it and to apply it wisely. And to the degree that we are threatened today, the biggest danger to our own life, not only to all life on our planet, is our own self. So the biggest shift we need to do today is not technological and it's not a scientific one. And that's another issue I have with transhumanism, is that idea is like, oh, let's have cryonics, let's have mind uploading, let's have AI, let's have more powerful technology that we've ever had and we'll be okay and we'll solve all of our problems. Bullshit, okay? Bullshit. Why? Because the problems we have today are not necessarily problems of science and technology. The biggest problems that we have today are a result of our other issues. And unless we solve those other issues, or at least catch up a little bit on our wisdom, we are only going to make matters worse by giving us even more powerful tools and bats to smash each other on our heads with and to pelt the world with. And so we need a big shift. Yes, I agree 100% with you, but that's not a technological...
That's the shift. What you've just articulated is the shift that was the thing that spoke to me most about FM. It was a shift of attitude, a shift of values. It's funny because Steve Fuller said, like, you know, FM, you know, presented these things that transhumanists present, but he presented it with in a certain time frame. That first we would have universalism. We don't talk about borders. We don't talk about you're Russian, I'm Jewish. We don't. Abundance, which would obviously come into play with some scientific progress. This sort of idea of optimism, not an optimism where the glass is half full, but an optimism where we felt we could improve and we rallied to make something happen. And then, and only then, would we then have, you know, the last thing on his list was immortality. But, you know, like Steve Fuller said, like FM hoped that it would happen, you know, in this way. Now things are happening, you know, in different sequences. And like you just described, that kind of is a scary proposition when we haven't made the shift and we're suddenly given toys, you know, or scientific technologies that we, you know, aren't, we're equipped to use by pressing a button, but we're not equipped to use in terms of, yeah. And to me, that's one of the scariest things in terms of our world going forward.
Steve Fuller is one of my favorite transhumanists, by the way. He's also among the most knowledgeable by far. But going back to the point is, We are currently enthralled by the how, by the technology. We're enthralled by the how. We worship the how. My suggestion, and FM suggestion apparently, is going back to ask the why and the what, which were the original questions that the ancient Greeks and the Romans asked. And by the way, the Persians were very close to them culturally in many ways. They have many overlaps there for a number of historical reasons. So we need to shift from the how to the why and the what, and the how only comes later, only comes at that point. And if you start with the how, you would likely do more damage than good, because you don't know your why and you don't know your what. And then you end up with the warning of Yuval Noah Harari, the way he finishes his first book, Sapiens, and he says, is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want?
Yes, gods who actually don't know. That we have a lot of we have a lot of.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, we have a lot of aspiring gods today.
And the transhumanism is promising each and every one to become a god, to become immortal, to become omnipotent, to become omnipresent. Uploaded, augmented super being that would outlast our planet and the sun and all of that. But do we even know why we want to do that? Do we even know what to do with that? And what good is immortality if you never ask what good is immortality? And if you never ask the idea why and what for and what am I going to do? And those are questions that are equally valuable only if you have 8 years, by the way, but most people never ask them. And that's why I think in that sense, Stoic philosophy and ancient Epicureanism, Cyrenianic philosophy are very useful.
Thank you. It's been fun, interesting. We can probably go on for days. I really do appreciate you watching the film and your honest appraisal, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.